Dr. Catherine Hall. Dr. Hall is a junior medical officer at the Canberra Hospital who has completed a term with the hepatobiliary surgery unit. She has a keen interest in global surgery and hopes to pursue a career in general surgery. Again, like I said, please type in your questions in the chat box. Please welcome Catherine.
Hello, my name is Catherine. I'm one of the interns at Canberra Hospital. Let me just get this up for you. So this is a meta-analysis looking at whether routine intraoperative cholangiography is necessary in cholecystectomies. Intraoperative cholangiography is performed during laparoscopic cholecystectomy to identify biliary tree anatomy, identify and prevent bile duct injury, arguably the most serious complication of cholecystectomies, and to identify choledocholithiasis. For these reasons, many perform IOCs routinely during cholecystectomies. However, some argue that IOCs should be performed selectively in patients who are at high risk of pancreatitis, jaundice, have a history of abnormal LFTs or CBD dilatation on imaging. But there's no standard criteria and it's up to individual surgeons to determine who is at risk. Those who argue that selective IOC is best state that routine IOC increases operative time, costs, ionizing radiation exposure to staff and patients, that IOC in general reports several false positives and that there may be unnecessary CBD explorations and ERCPs and their consequences, and that there are actually similar rates of bile duct injury between selective and routine IOCs. So this study compared routine IOC to selective IOC in patients undergoing cholecystectomy, looking at the following outcomes: bile duct injury rates, CBD stone detection rates, CBD stones on follow-up, and other complications. So the PRISMA criteria were adapted and a systematic search yielded just over 9,000 patients, with approximately 62% undergoing routine IOC and 38% undergoing selective IOC. The data were pooled and odds ratio 95% confidence intervals were calculated, and heterogeneity was assessed with I-squared statistics. First of our results, this study found a trend towards lower bile duct injury rates in the routine IOC group compared to the selective group. Several studies reported rates of other medical and surgical issues postoperatively, including biliary leaks, wound infections, and respiratory issues. Again, there was a trend towards these complications occurring less in the routine IOC group. There was a much greater rate of CBD stone detection on routine IOCs at 5.8% compared to the selective group at 2%, and this was the only finding that was statistically significant. However, there was no difference in CBD stone retainment on follow-up. There was a trend towards lower bile duct injury rates and lower complications of other causes in routine IOCs compared to the selective, but a higher rate of CBD stones detected in routine IOCs compared to selective, but on follow-up, the rates of choledocholithiasis were the same. So what have other meta-analyses found? A recent Swedish meta-analysis found lower rates of bile duct injury in routine IO compared to selective IOCs, and this has been the only study to have found a statistically significant difference. They also found that the economic benefit of increased quality adjusted life years from reduced morbidity and mortality associated with lower bile duct injury and readmission rates more than compensated for the cost of performing IOCs routinely. However, this study included studies that we had excluded, such as observational studies and a large study that arbitrarily just defined a selective IOC surgeon as one who recorded less than 90% of IOCs during cholecystectomies. It also included studies from the late 80s and 90s, as did ours, and arguably the rates of bile duct injuries have decreased with better skills and technology available. An Irish meta-analysis also found that there was a trend towards lower bile duct injury rates in routine compared to selective IOCs, but they found that there was greater bile duct injury rates in cases where IOC was performed compared to cases where no IOC was performed. In Australia, between 2014 and 2015, 81% of Black collies had intraoperative cholangiography, ranging from 53% in the Northern Territory to 89% here in the ACT. The Medibank Surgical Variance Report from 2017 showed that what happens in the private sector is a little different, with 75% of Black collies having an IOC, and it could be speculated that these patients are at lower risk of CBD stones if electively performed, and that surgeons in this field may take a more selective approach. Additionally, as this figure represents, only 33% of surgeons billed an IOC for every lap collie and 7% not billing any at all. With 60% of surgeons billing IOCs for some patients, this may be a reflection that up to 60% of surgeons privately perform IOCs selectively. A study from this year and published in the ANZ Journal of Surgery found that in the 20 years to December 2019, there was nearly a 32% increase in IOCs billed, but only a 7% increase in cholecystectomies. Additionally, they found a minimal change in the rates of bile duct injury, and in the Australian setting, they claim that routine IOCs may be unwarranted. Our data show that there was a higher rate of CBD stones detected on routine IOC. However, the follow-up rate of CBD stones were the same. This is likely because up to 50% of stones will pass spontaneously, and studies performed, including one here in Canberra by Dr. Andrew Thompson, found that between 27 to 47% of IOCs that suggested a CBD stone had no stone at the time of ERCP. From here, there's a decision for expectant management of low-risk stones and avoiding further interventions, and then balancing that with the risk of cholangitis, pancreatitis, and readmission if a retained stone were to cause issues. So even the Tokyo guidelines from 2018 state that there's no evidence for the value of IOC, as there's been mixed results from studies, but they suggest that it should be routinely performed, citing level D evidence. However, the 2019 Medicare Task Force report states that it's best practice and essential to incentivize the performance of IOC routinely, but evidence they cite to support their statement is from the early 90s. Really, the study is in support of IOC, given the trends, but there's no strict evidence to guide practice one way or another. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Catherine.